Humanity Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Dr. Suzanne Bleiberg-Sepperson, and this is our 15th episode of the podcast, Antisemitism and the United Nations and in Society on hmTV. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest, Mr. Jonathan Harounoff, International Spokesperson and Senior Communications Advisor for Israel's mission to the United Nations. Appointed in late 2024, he serves as a key diplomatic representative for Israel in New York, often discussing issues related to Iran, Hamas, and Middle Eastern affairs. He's also the author of a new book, Unveiled, Inside Iran's Women, Life, Freedom, Revolt, which explores the role of women in Iranian resistance and was recently published in September 2025. His book couldn't be more timely, and we're very grateful with all that is going on right now that he's taking the time to be with us. So thank you. So welcome, and let's start with some questions about your background. You have been described as a British-Iranian journalist, currently serving as the international spokesperson and senior communications advisor for Israel's mission to the United Nations. Could you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and your family?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me on your show. I was born and raised in London to an Israeli mother and British father, and grandparents and great-grandparents from Iran. Growing up, I was surrounded by Israeli music, Israeli food, the Hebrew language, amazing cuisine, and at the same time, Farsi, carpets, tapestries. So I had these competing cultures surrounded by these things and all the great things of both cultures. And at the same time, you turn on the TV and you hear about ongoing conflict and tensions between Iran and Israel. And it would appear, just based on what you hear on the news, that these two countries have been at war forever. And the reality couldn't be further from the truth. And as someone who's a trained journalist, I wanted to better understand, both the good aspects of this relationship, but also, the more difficult ones. And the news is dominated by, of course, developments around conflict between Israel and the Islamic Republic. But I was also interested in what life looked like pre-1979, what Iran under the Shah, the last Shah of Iran, what his relationship was like towards his own Jewish population, which had as many as 100,000 people inside Iran. Now it has about 10,000, yet it's still the second largest Jewish community in the Middle East. I also wanted to understand what Iran at that time, what its relationship was like with the West, with Israel, with the United States, and with other countries. And it really was eye-opening, and it's what led me eventually to write this book about humanizing and putting a spotlight on the people of Iran. Because so often we hear about what the Islamic Republic is doing, what its nuclear program looks like, what its proxies are doing, its dangerous and expensive foreign policy, but we're not talking enough about the people of Iran, who they are, what their stories are, who are these 93 million people, do they like the West, do they want to have a relationship with Israel, with the United States? And the reality, based on my interviews with dozens and dozens of Iranians inside Iran and in the diaspora, is that the vast majority of them do want to have a relationship with the outside world. They are clamoring for change, and they're growingly and increasingly dissatisfied with the Islamic Republic that they've lived under for the past 47 years.
So let me ask you about your experience in England. What, in terms of being Jewish, in terms of your religiosity and your families, did you experience any anti-Semitism while you were there? Was it because of the Israeli background, if you did, or the Iranian-Persian background? What was your experience like growing up, on a day-to-day basis?
I was very fortunate to have not personally been subjected to any anti-Semitic attacks, but it was a very ordinary thing to go to. I went to a very Jewish primary school and a Jewish high school, and it was a very normal thing to, arrive at school surrounded by security, very heavily guarded, like Buckingham Palace level security without the fancy uniform, of course. And that's not a normal thing. I thought it was a normal thing. It's completely normalized. But then you go, to a non-Jewish school, and that's completely anathema to what they're. So these kinds of inbuilt protections and just situations and going to synagogue as well, where you have to have security that's sometimes armed, and definitely there'll be some kind of presence there. But we would always hear about, an anti-Semitic incident here, there, a fellow high school student getting beaten up. So it was always around, but I was fortunate not to have experienced it myself. There was one instance when I was applying to university where I had without disclosing the name of the university, where I had one particularly and egregiously anti-Semitic line of questioning in one of my interviews. And I understand that when you apply to, Ivy League or in the UK Russell Group level or Oxbridge level kinds of universities, you're sometimes pushed to see if how you'll respond. They're trying to provoke you to see, how you'll react, if you can stand your ground on an intellectual basis. But this conversation wasn't like that. The conversation that I recall having consisted of somebody delivering a very virulently antagonistic monologue about why Israel was an apartheid state, why it was a terrible place. And that was because I had implied that I was interested in studying more about the Middle East, Israel, and so on and so forth. And that seemed to have triggered this interviewer, which was, I would classify that experience as a form of anti-Semitism. But of course, there have been much worse forms of anti-Semitism that other people have experienced.
Well, dare I ask, did you get into the school?
Well, if I said I did, then you'd know where I went.
Okay.
Then you'd know where it happened.
Well, for what it's worth, I was going to mention your educational background in any case, because that's public information. So, but we'll just move right along. So, what do you think influenced your career path to the worlds of government service and journalism?
I've always been interested in stories, in writing, in media, in journalism. So I always knew I was going to go into that line of work. As an undergraduate, I had the privilege of studying Arabic and Farsi, Middle Eastern history, living in Morocco for a year as well. And then after that, I was writing articles for a variety of international publications. I had the opportunity to study at Harvard, at the grad school there, learn under some of the top journalists and editors, and build that skill. And use it to tell the stories of the people inside the Middle East, not just the topics, the incendiary topics that you hear about in the headlines, but the actual people and their stories. And I always gravitated towards feature stories around one particular piece that I particularly fond of. It happened to be published in Haaretz at the time, but it was I had interviewed. It was around the time that Iran was facing sanctions, and I interviewed an Iranian American woman who lived on the west coast of the United States, who still is running a very successful Persian rug business. And she was talking about, her attachment to the culture, the difficulties around it. And it was really a privilege to spotlight that story.
So I know that you've had a wonderful career, an exemplary career, but I know for part of that, you were the director of communications at JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Did that have any bearing on your current position in terms of representing the Israeli government?
Not so much. It was a great experience. I started that role actually a week or so before October the 7th. So the plan was to focus on topics like Israeli-Saudi normalization, other things that were geared towards the prospect of peace and expanding peace in the Middle East. And then everything, of course, went out the window with October the 7th. But that was a good experience, and it helped in certain ways. But the way I ended up at the mission was more of a stroke of good luck, and just being at the right place at the right time. I was writing an article for one newspaper, and I was invited by the Israeli mission to cover an event that they were holding at the UN, where they were showing the 47-minute footage of the Hamas atrocities. And they had invited hundreds of diplomats, journalists, community leaders. Surprisingly, the Secretary General couldn't make it. He had a schedule conflict, apparently. But the room was packed, and it was very jarring, the footage. If I can recall correctly, the event started with a speech by the son of Hamas as well, Mossab. And I wrote an article about it that didn't get much traction because not enough people were reading articles. But then I tweeted about it, and it went very viral. And the previous ambassador saw it, and we started a conversation. And then when this opportunity came up, I jumped in.
Good for you. So getting back to your degrees, including your degrees from Cambridge, Harvard, and Columbia, what is your take on the reasons for so much overt anti-Semitism on college campuses today? And how do you account for the weak response from these elite colleges' presidents and administrations?
Fundamentally, these institutions possess a lot of good. They have a lot of potential. It's like the UN as well. It's got immense potential there. Many of the students come there, bright-eyed, wanting to change the world. There are many professors there who do a stellar job. Much of the curricula is good. But ultimately, no matter how good the university is, it's only as good as what is being taught and what the students are being taught, what they're learning, what they're taking away from that experience. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the past few years, especially since October the 7th, is that there's almost been a trend on jumping on the bandwagon of demonizing Israel, taking part in these protests, these encampments. The fundamental principle of protesting is good. There's nothing wrong with it. But when that protesting takes on nefarious forms that are really not guided by logic or fact, and they're driven by people who really aren't, who are just looking at a very select piece of news or TikToks or whatever, and they've painted a picture in their head of what an Israeli or a Jewish person is like. That makes the university setting extremely dangerous, and that really damages the whole learning experience for everyone. And it was very disappointing to see at some of my alma maters this happen to frightening levels. But it really happened. It was really globalized in a way, and there's so much ignorance that it was quite frightening, because people believed. There were instances where people actually believed what they were chanting, and I don't know if believing what you're chanting or just chanting it and not really believing it, which one's worse.
Interesting question. So do you think the protests are primarily anti-Israel, or are they also anti-America or anti-Western civilization?
I think they can take on various forms, and there's a lot of overlap in all of those things. There were many, whoever is perceived to be or framed as the stronger person, or the quote-unquote, underdog, or the smaller guy, is usually the one that gets a lot of support. And the United States, of course, is an immense force, and Israel is, out of necessity, become a very strong force, and its enemies are sometimes framed, many times inaccurately, as these weak forces, that have just and the reality couldn't be further from the truth. But I think, though, in answer to your question, the protests can usually touch on all of those themes. Sometimes, if you're protesting against Israel, you're usually protesting against the West. The chants and the slogans are usually touching on the same themes of just being against the West.
So you mentioned October 7th previously, and what can I say? I am the child of Holocaust survivors, and it seems as more of the actual survivors are passing on, they've almost been eclipsed by October 7th and what's going on. And we've always thought that education would be a remedy to alleviate, or even better, get rid of anti-Semitism, and that education is the cure. But I'm asking this, do you think education has failed?
It's a really difficult question because it almost seems as if people are educated with different things. So there are, like for example, sometimes people say they're so confused as to why somebody could spout something so horrific, so anti-Semitic. Like, how could you possibly say that? He's so educated. Mm-hmm. But then the follow-up question should be what has he or she been educated with? Like who taught them? What have they told them? And we're unfortunately at a time of intense polarization where people are being taught different sets of facts, and their reality is true to them, even if it's not actual reality. And whatever you say, whatever history book, unfortunately, you put in front of them, whichever museum you show them, that's not going to, unfortunately, change their reality, their perception, their TikTok algorithm, and it's very scary.
So any thoughts about how to influence the United Nations and its frankly unfair treatment of Israel?
There are many, I think, arguments to be had. I think there's one camp of people who believe that Israel should play no part in the United Nations. That why is Israel taking part in an institution that is so myopically focused on the delegitimization, isolation, demonization of the state of Israel? I don't fall into that camp. I think, having spent almost 2 years there, that even though the United Nations has a tremendous number of shortcomings, it has a lot of potential, and it does have the global spotlight. And Israel, people who support Israel, people who support the West, the United States, I think we can do a much better job from within. If you're criticizing the United Nations from without, you're not going to have as much impact as if you're doing it from within. Just one example, we, for the past year and a half, before all of our hostages returned home, we used the global platform of the United Nations, of the General Assembly, of the Security Council, of the press conference areas, to bring families of hostages and recently released hostages to the United Nations so that they can speak directly to those very senior officials who never came to their aid since October the 7th. Had we not been a member state of the UN, we wouldn't have been able to do that. Mm-hmm. Earlier today, at the time of this recording, we brought a drone, parts of an Iranian Shahed 136 drone, to the United Nations to show, because sometimes people are speaking in abstract ways about the dangers posed by the Islamic Republic, not just to Israel, not just to the United States, but you're seeing many capitals in the Middle East, even stretching also as far as Turkey and Cyprus. We brought parts of the drone to show people just how dangerous and how errant the Islamic Republic has become, how it doesn't serve its people. It stopped doing that decades ago, but how it's also a threat to the world. And had we not been a member state of the UN, we wouldn't have been able to do that. So I think having a seat at the table and using it in a constructive, effective way is much more successful in the long term than just instinctively reacting negatively and kicking up a fuss and leaving, and then you're forgotten about and somebody else will take your place.
I couldn't agree with you more, because as we talked earlier, I'm the chair at the UN of the Committee End Anti-Semitism and Promote Peace, which is part of the Conference of NGOs. And many people have said, are you banging your head against the wall? And my answer is exactly what you said. Better to be on the inside than the outside. So I'd like to just move on to, I know time is very short, but Israel has been accused of genocide in Gaza. Now, if we look at history, during World War II, the United States and its allied bombings over Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Dresden, and the urban warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan, which produced many, many civilian casualties, because that's part of the, quote, fog of war. Yet none of them were accused of genocide. So what, if anything, do you think is different about the war in Gaza, or is it simply the anti-Semitism and the fact that Israel is engaged in that war and frankly is the stronger party?
I think those are true. I think it's also, unfortunately, there was a strong case of historical amnesia. As October the 7th got further and further away, people forgot about what triggered the war. And as Israel was intensifying its operations in eliminating Hamas's infrastructure and returning the hostages, people forgot more and more about how this all started. But it almost got to the point where the legal concept of what constitutes a genocide was very much cheapened, and it didn't actually mean much. Anyone could just throw around that name and assume that it just became fact. But when you actually consult with legal experts and look at the meaning of genocide and how Israel, as a very mighty force, could have actually conducted a genocide had it wanted to, which it doesn't, of course. It could have done so in less than a day. But of course it didn't do that. And as a result, a lot of Israelis lost their lives. And there was a lot of civilian suffering as well in Israel, in the north, in the south, and elsewhere. So it's always been, unfortunately, a dishonest take on the situation. And I think it's been the arguments have been put out there ad nauseum as well.
I know time is very short, and I have so many questions to ask you. So September 12th, 2025 at the UN, there was the New York Declaration for a two-state solution. There were 142 out of 193 nations at the UN voted in favor of it. And do you think establishing a Palestinian state now is a reward for Hamas's barbarity?
I think that was very much the perception back then. When all of these discussions were taking place, a lot of the countries that supported this idea were very proud of themselves, patting themselves on the back, but they weren't actually doing anything constructive in order to lead to peace in Gaza and in Israel. And the United Nations, unfortunately, played quite a limited role in eventually brokering a ceasefire. They did it from the sidelines, and when peace actually came about in the Washington, D.C., at the White House, with President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, when they unveiled their peace plan in October, I believe. But it was, I think it's a very damning indictment on where the United Nations was, because it didn't use the massive platform and opportunity it had during High Level Week, which, by the way, much of it fell on Rosh Hashanah, but that's besides the point. Didn't use that massive platform, and many of the heads of state didn't use that platform to actually try and bring about peace, but instead they made these noisy but empty statements and declarations, and it didn't really amount to anything. And the real impetus only arrived a week or so later, as I mentioned, in Washington, D.C., and it's a shame.
One of the things that really concerns me is that support for Israel in the United States used to be a bipartisan interest. And it seems to me that the extremes of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, have stopped giving their support to Israel, and I fear that it's growing. So do you have any thoughts on what can be done to make support for Israel more mainstream and bipartisan?
I think there are always, there's always concern when any fringe is involved, because they are extreme in their nature. But I think highlighting the reality that supporting Israel doesn't come at the expense of supporting America. These are two very, these things go hand in hand. And sometimes there's an argument that supporting Israel means you're not America first. And as we've seen just now with what's happening in Iran with Operation Epic Fury and Roaring Lion, is the fact that if you are Israel first, you're also America first. Both countries share the same goal of eliminating the nuclear threat posed by the Islamic Republic and decimating its ballistic missile arsenal and decapitating its proxy network, and allowing the people of Iran, the people who I'm so attached to and have written about for a very long time, giving them that long sought after opportunity of freedom that they've been trying to get hold of for the past 47 years.
So my last question today, and I want to put in a plug. I'm sorry we don't have the book in front of us, Unveiled, and I can't wait to read it because it's so current. It's about what's going on in Iran, and you've done all these wonderful interviews, so there's a lot for us to learn from. But my last question to you is, what would you like the listeners to today's podcast, what would you like them to take away from our conversation?
I think the key takeaway is that the Islamic Republic of Iran does not represent the Iranian people. The Iranian people are a proud civilization, stretches back thousands of years, and the Islamic Republic are a 47-year-old almost blip. And that's why many people inside Iran and outside of Iran in the diaspora, they almost get insulted when people describe the Islamic Republic as the Iranian regime, or when they describe the IRGC as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps when it's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Because to them, Iran is not the Islamic Republic, and there's nothing Iranian, essentially, in the Islamic Republic. So one of the key takeaways through the stories of the brave women and men who I had the opportunity to speak to and highlight and spotlight in the book is that they are very different to the Islamic Republic, and they are more similar to us than we may think.
Thank you. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your time and your insights with us, and thank the audience for turning into this episode of Anti-Semitism and the United Nations and in Society on hmTV. I appreciate my guest, Mr. Harounoff, International Spokesperson and Senior Communications Advisor for Israel's mission to the United Nations, for sharing his perspective on Israel, the UN, and the ongoing war in Iran. We look forward to reading more from you and hearing more from you. So be sure to subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations. Until next time, make it our time. Take care and be well.